Hey everybody, Evan Savage here. I'm the pastor of Grassroots Church. Thank you for joining us by watching our messages from this past week or maybe weeks before. We are glad that you're taking time out of your week to learn, to engage with our church from an online point of view. We would love for you to join us on Sunday mornings for tangible community worship and of course some messages as well. And if that interests you, we would love for you to join us at 10 a.m. on Sunday mornings. Thank you again, and I hope that this message is edifying to your spirit.
This passage of Scripture is really the shifting point in the whole Gospel of Mark. It's actually the shifting point in Matthew and Luke as well. But in Mark, this is where the narrative shifts for Mark. It goes from chapters 1 through the first half of chapter 8 are all about who Jesus is, his identity through things like miracles and teaching, his authority, his power, all of those things. From this section on, it's about his mission. What is Jesus here to do? And that mission is the cross, crucified, and resurrected on the third day. But this question that Jesus asks his disciples really is one that reorients everything we think we know or we believe about Jesus. And in order to have faith in Christ, we have to confront this question ourselves. We have to answer this question that Jesus asks his disciples for ourselves. You see, we live in this world of endless spiritual options, right? And in many ways, we could even tailor-make our own spiritual option. We could say, well, I like a little Hindu here, a little Buddhist here. I like, whatever the rocks and the things and whatever, like the stones that people do, or like the New Age stuff. We could do all of that, and maybe you've heard somebody say, and I'll have a little Jesus because I like what Jesus teaches. I like how Jesus acts, so that's all good. So we could tailor-make our whole belief system, really, if we want to. And our approaches to faith, our approaches to following Jesus or our faith in general tends to be, often, I would say, tends to be about what makes us feel good. Like what helps us feel better about ourselves. What helps us, maybe it's justify our actions or justify our behavior in the way we live. You see, I was thinking about this. I don't think people really outright reject Jesus. I think what happens is we tend to shape Jesus in our own image far too often. We tend to say, this is the kind of Jesus I like, or this is the kind of Jesus I think he ought to be. So when Jesus confronts us with that, I think it causes some issues in our own faith. And so right here, in the middle of this gospel, in Mark chapter 8, Jesus is going to walk his disciples through that tension. He's actually going to walk them directly into, I would say, that tension. So Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 27. Mark writes this: Jesus went out with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They answered him, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." "But you," he asked them, "who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he strictly warned them not to tell no one about him. Then he began to teach them that it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed and rise after 3 days. He spoke openly about this. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. It's a lot of guts there. But turning around and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking about God's concerns, but humans' concerns." He says Jesus went out with his disciples out of the villages around Caesarea Philippi. A lot of times, I think, we will glaze over or gloss over the setting in certain things. I think this one, the Caesarea Philippi, is an insanely important setting for this story. It's not a throwaway detail. This city, it was built by, so when King Herod the Great died, so King Herod the Great was the king of Israel, or Palestine really, during the time of Jesus' birth. When he died, he split the kingdom between what are known as tetrarchs. So basically split it into 4. He gave 3 of them to 3 of his sons and 1 of them to his sister. This guy, his name is Herod Philip, or Philip Herod. He was in charge of like the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, as well as the Decapolis. So that was what he was over. And he built this city that was dedicated to Caesar at the time, Caesar Tiberius, and he named it Caesarea, Caesar, Philippi, Philip. So Caesar and Philip together. And in this city, Philip built shrines, pagan shrines. He built one to Caesar, he built one to Baal, and then he built one to a Greek god named Pan. And that's why today it's called Peneus, is what the town is called today. And so because of this setting, all of these things happen. Jesus is taking his disciples into the midst of insanely amounts of pagan worship and ritual. And you have to ask the question, why would Jesus purposefully go out of his way, because it's pretty far north of the Sea of Galilee, why would he take his disciples pretty far out of the way in order to have this conversation in this town amidst these pagan temples? And it's because I would say a true confession of who Jesus is shouldn't really happen when we are comfortable and cozy. I would say in the West, we actually create our church gatherings around making it as easy as possible for somebody to come to know Jesus. Jesus, if you know, we'll talk about a little bit more of what it means to follow Jesus next week, because Jesus just keeps it rolling here. But we tend to think we want comfy, we want cozy, we want air conditioning, we want nice lights, we want it easy, we want, next steps class. We want all of those things to happen, but Jesus is taking them into the midst of the world's darkest place. It's not a safe place, but this is in the shadow of the world's counterfeit options. This is in the shadow. He takes them right to the footstep of the counterfeit. It's not cozy, it's not comfortable, but it's in the darkness of the world. One writer says, when the arrows of false systems, idiotic politics, crazy amounts of information, this is where confession of Jesus as Lord holds true power. Think about this. This is where a confession of Jesus as Lord holds true power, not in the safety of a pew or at a cushioned altar. So with the pressures of money, for us today, with the pressures of money, wealth, comfort, tasks, production, fame, our desire for self-identification, we are confronted with, who do you say I am? But he begins first by kind of easing the disciples into it by saying, who do other people say that I am? And now they give a respectful answer. They're like, some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're one of the prophets. And those are respectful answers, but we know that they're wrong. But why are they wrong? They're not wrong in acknowledging Jesus' significance to the way of to their faith. They are wrong because they are not embracing the uniqueness of Christ. They are lumping Christ together with all of the other crazy prophets that came before them. They're not recognizing truly Jesus as Lord. And then Peter, with his impulsive, passionate behavior, says, you are the Christ. I think he probably says that without thinking about it. He probably says, obviously, because he rebukes him later on. Now, this word Christos in Latin is the same in Greek. It's Messiah, or Christos is in Greek. It means Messiah. It means anointed one. And for the Jewish people at that time, the Messiah was the deliverer, the national deliverer for their people. So it was more of a political thing. In fact, King David was called Messiah as well, as he was anointed to be king of Israel some 1,500 years or so before this. And Jesus, he accepts that confession. He accepts that Peter calls him the Messiah, but then he tells them not to spread it. Now this happens a lot in the Gospel of Mark, but I think Jesus, for this confession in particular, he doesn't want them to spread it because he knows they don't actually know what that means. For him to be the Messiah, they are thinking golden throne, they are thinking palaces, they are thinking armies and swords and politics. What they are not thinking is death on a cross. Now, if you know the Matthew version of the story, I just want to touch on this really quickly because this is where some stuff. So in Matthew chapter 16, verse 17 through 19, it's not up there, but just listen. Jesus adds to the response of Peter. He says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven." Now, elephant in the room is this Peter rock thing, right? If you're like a recovering Catholic or whatever, right? Now, I think we would always assume that there are really two options. Either Peter is the rock on which the church is built, or the statement that Peter says is the rock on which the church is built. But there's actually four equally argued about options for this text. The first option is the Catholic option. Peter is the rock. That's unlikely for a couple of reasons. One, Peter is Petros, which is a masculine name. It's actually a first name. Petros, Peter, it's a masculine name. When Jesus says on this rock, go ahead and throw that first photo up there. When Jesus says on this rock I will build my church, he uses the word Petra, which means massive cliff face. So unlikely that Peter is that rock. The second thing, and this is a good explanation, is that the faith or the confession of Jesus as Messiah is the rock. I think I believe some of that. That's a good thing to believe. It's a little bit less imaginative, I would say, but it's good. The third thing is Jesus is the rock. That's, again, unlikely because he uses Petra, which is a feminine word. Petros, masculine, Petra, feminine. That was not a common, maybe it's a little punny, but it wasn't a common kind of use of language back then. The fourth option, which is my favorite option, is the option that Jesus is looking. He has his disciples down here somewhere at the foot of this massive cliff, and he's looking at this cliff, and he's saying, on this rock, I will build my church. In other words, on top of all of the falsehoods, over and above all of the counterfeits that the world is throwing at you, my church will stand supreme. Right? Isn't that one of the things that Jesus, we tend to not understand about Jesus' teachings, is that Jesus is using pretty much anything around him at all times. Take the parable of the sower. Where was Jesus? He was in farm country, and he probably was teaching and said, take the man who is sowing seeds out in the field. Most likely, there probably was a dude sowing some seeds out in the field. So he's using his surroundings to teach a greater purpose. Now, let's look at Caesarea Philippi. I'm not as creative as Aiden, so I'm trying to be. So I should have, Let's look at the Caesarea Philippi. On the right there, that was the temple dedicated to Caesar. And on the left, it was the temple dedicated to Pan. Let's go to the next one. Now, behind the Pan thing is this cave. You can kind of see it there, right there. Now, inside of this cave, next picture, it looks like this. Now, back in the day, this would have been filled with water, and on that, where it says A, that would have been a big statue of Pan. Now, if you don't know who Pan was, or the god Pan, Pan is the god of the wild, the god of rustic music. It's where we get the term pan flute from, so the god of rustic music, so the god of Jesse and Heather. Flocks, so any sort of flock. But the most curious thing that Pan was the god of is he was the god of shepherds. So think about where Jesus is here, teaching them about who he is as the Messiah, the great shepherd of the sheep, and he's basically throwing stones at this mock temple. Now, there's another thing about Pan. Pan was known as, in the Greek and Roman world, Pan was known as kind of the most fiercest of the lesser gods. It's actually where we get the word panic from. Because if you were to go and meet Pan in the wilderness, you would only be consumed by fear. So panic was to be consumed by fear. The other thing that took place in this cave is filled with water. Because Pan caused so much fear and trembling amongst people, and people were scared of this god, it was filled with water. It was also a place where they sacrificed children in order to satisfy Pan's appetite. And so when Jesus says, "And the gates of hell shall not overcome it," that's the gates of hell that Jesus is talking about. So again, he's using the surrounding areas for his teaching thing. So the setting of Caesarea Philippi, vitally important. We must confess Jesus in the face of all of world's counterfeit faith and counterfeit religions. But then we get into the suffering Messiah. Jesus is redefining the term Messiah. In verses 31 through 32, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer. This is the first of three predictions that Jesus gives in the Gospel of Mark. First of three predictions about his death and resurrection. And you have to think for us, we know the story, it's kind of old news for us now, but for the disciples, this would have been rather disorienting for their psyches, right? Because in Peter's mind, and in the mind of all first century Jewish people, the expectation of the Messiah was a conquering king, not a crucified servant. That was the expectation. And Jesus begins to lay out his actual theology, I would say, of kingship. The first one is that he is going to suffer, not in spite of being the Messiah, but because he is the Messiah, that he will suffer. He will be rejected by the elders, chief priests, the scribes. The very ones who would have welcomed him to be the actual king of people are going to lead him to his death. He's going to be killed, not by accident, but by divine necessity. The Son of Man must suffer. Then on the third day, he will rise. This is known as the messianic paradox, that you show your power, or Christ shows his power and authority by being humble and by submission and by death. We read Isaiah 52 and 53 for prayer this morning. This is the personification of Isaiah 52 and 53, that the Son of Man must come and suffer, that the stone will be rejected. And that Son of Man comes from Daniel chapter 7, where the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7, if you don't know, the Son of Man receives dominion over all things. He receives power over all things. And then he says, but the Son of Man must suffer. See, this is the true shape. The suffering servant is the true shape of redemption. It's not a shape of domination. It's not a shape of coercion. It's not even a shape of earthly authority and power. It is the shape of what is known as cruciformity. It is the shape of the cross. And for us, let's think about how we live our lives, especially in today's day and age, today's world. Right? We grasp for power. We grasp for control. We grasp for influence, for authority. The desire to be right is something that we all probably wrestle with. Nobody likes to be wrong. You don't like to be wrong when you're called out on it, especially. But we must remember that the King of the universe, the creator of all things, he humbled himself, gave up worldly power and gave up worldly authority, and he submitted himself to earthly authorities and suffered and died. That is the king we serve. Right? And I think our paradox and our hypocrisy as followers of Jesus is that while we grasp for power, we also claim to follow that submitted Christ. While we grasp for authority, we also claim to be following that suffering servant. And Jesus is shifting. He's redefining what it means to be Messiah, what it means to be his follower, that submission and suffering leads to the greatest display of power and authority the world has ever seen. But then we get to this, what I would call the satanic resistance to the cross. There's a satanic resistance that we all have, that we resist the cross. And theologians wrestle with this. What's the meaning of the cross? Like everybody, because it makes us so uncomfortable that Christ would have to die on a cross. In verse 33, Peter understandably recoils a little bit. Like, hold on, whoa. Hold on a second. It says, Peter took him aside, began to rebuke him. Oh, sweet Peter. I mean, it takes a lot of guts to you just called the dude the Messiah. It takes a lot of guts to go up and be like, hey, whoa, chill out with that suffering stuff. King over all, right? But we do that too, I would say, often. We accept Jesus far too often on our terms, right? On how we perceive Christ. And when Christ doesn't meet our kind of low, idiotic expectations, we rebuke him. And we say, no, that's not the Christ that I want to believe in. Next week, which is my favorite passage in all of Scripture, is take up your cross and follow me. I mean, that is the command of Christ. We do not like that at all. We want Christ to be warm and cozy and fuzzy. We don't want action, right? We just want belief. We don't want to be called into something greater, something more purposeful, something more impactful in this world. We just want, I just want to believe and kind of live my life. But then Jesus rebukes him with the sharpest of rebukes. Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me, Satan. It's fascinating that these two stories are boom, boom. Messiah, Satan, Messiah. It's boom, boom, boom. The truth of the matter is Satan will always tempt us to avoid the cross. Satan is not out there ooh, let me get them to do something evil. No, he is, Satan, what's the word? Satan is he's gonna walk with you just enough in this faith, but then he's gonna try to steer you just slightly away from following Christ. Slightly away. It's not like devil horns and all this stuff. He's just gonna mess with your faith in little tiny ways that are gonna steer you away. And this is, Satan will always tempt us away from the cross. If we recall in the wilderness, Mark chapter 1, also Matthew chapter 4 or whatever, Satan tempts Jesus to take the kingdom without suffering. That was the temptation that Satan gave to Jesus. Take your kingdom. He takes him up on the mountain, you know the story. Here's your kingdom. Take it. All you got to do is bow down or whatever. He tempts him to take the kingdom without suffering. And what is Peter doing here? He's doing the same exact thing. The same exact thing. It's the same thing that we do all the time in our lives. And Jesus names it for what it is. It's a spiritual shortcut. It's not actually living in faith in Christ. It's not actually being compelled and transformed by his resurrection power. It is rejecting the call towards the cross. As Bonhoeffer puts it, a Messiah or Christ without the cross is cheap faith. Christ without the cross. It's cheap. It doesn't mean anything. There's no weight to it. And a disciple who refuses the cross is not a follower of Jesus, is not a discipleship of Christ, but in fact we are antithesis of who Jesus is. We are actually going against, being anti-Christ, not the antichrist, we're not dispensationalist. But being anti-Christ does not mean that you are the exact opposite of Christ. Being anti-Christ is that you are anti the will and the way and the mission of Christ. In that mission, if we do not embrace the cross, if we do not embrace the suffering servant, if we do not reject earthly power, authority, earthly wealth, fame, blah, 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 if we do not reject those things, then we are living in a life of cheap faith. Jesus says, you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of man. What are those things? Power, authority, wealth, influence, whatever. Pick your other thing that we like so much in our world. And that's the challenge, I think, that Jesus gives us. Too often our minds are far too small for the real gospel. It's far too small for the real gospel. We want power, Jesus chooses weakness. We want safety, Jesus chooses sacrifice. We want Jesus who secures our comfort. And what does he give us in return? He gives us a cross. We want the nice stuff. We want the easy stuff. But Jesus is calling us to a sacrificial life. And I would say discipleship, being a disciple of Jesus, making disciples of Jesus, discipleship, I would say, truly begins where our expectations die. Our expectations of Jesus, all of those things. This is this phrase, these two stories, which I don't know why the Bible split these stories up. It's one story. This story is. It is not just like the turning point in Mark's gospel, but it is the turning point in all of our lives. We either follow Jesus as he is, the crucified Christ, the suffering Son of Man, or we follow an idol in our own image. We are sitting there at Caesarea Philippi trying to figure out how we could fit Jesus into one of those buildings. Right? And so that question rings out so true today. Who do you say that Jesus is? Who do you say that Jesus is? Not in theory, not on paper, not just a good Sunday school answer, but who do you say Jesus is? Because your answer to that question will either transform you into Christ's likeness or allow you to fall away. If you say he's just a nice guy who teaches good stuff and did good things, that's not the suffering servant. That's not the Christ. That's not the Messiah. It's not the King of all. That's just another thinker in the world filled with thinkers. Like when your life is broken, when your comfort is threatened, when the path of obedience leads us towards a cross, who do you say Christ is? Who do you say Christ is? Will you say, Christ, you are enough? You are enough. You are worth it even when the road gets hard. Or will you allow yourself to fall away? Because the truth of the matter is, if Jesus is the Christ, if we believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the deliverer, the redeemer, the creator of all things, if we believe that, the only faithful response to that reality is to get behind Jesus. That is the only real response. If that's what we claim to believe, that is the only response. A year ago we talked about being with Jesus, being like Jesus, and doing what Jesus did. That is the only real response to Jesus as Christ. It is to carry a cross, not avoid a cross. It's to lose our lives for his sake. And one writer put it, lose our lives for his sake and then find them again on the third day. I love that. That's a good one. So next week we're going to pick up where Jesus commands his disciples into a life of cross-bearing. But it begins here. It begins with a confession of Jesus as Messiah and a correction of what Jesus as Messiah actually means. The truth is Jesus is the Messiah, but he's not the kind of Messiah we expected. He is the Christ, but he is going to lead his nation and his people and his kingdom through suffering. He is the Lord and the King of all, but again, he doesn't rule from a throne. He's going to rule from a cross. So this morning, I pray that every day we might wake up and say, you are the Messiah, the suffering servant, the suffering Son of Man. I pray that we will follow him earnestly and honestly. Earnestly means constant. Honestly means when we fail, we admit that we fail. We don't rebuke Jesus because he didn't meet our own failure, but we admit that we fail and we get back up and we continue to follow him earnestly. And my prayer is that we are transformed by the Messiah that we are transformed by the Messiah that we are not expecting. Right? And we are transformed by the Messiah that we desperately, desperately need. I think far too often do we, far too often, I think, in our faith walks, our struggling to be disciples of Jesus, that we allow other noises, other theologies or Christologies, we allow other worldviews, all these things to impact and influence what it truly means to be a follower of Jesus, what it truly means to be to do what Jesus did, to allow ourselves to be servants of all to the point of suffering. I love, when Jesus gets to the end of his earthly life, when he gets to the end there, he doesn't hold anything back from his disciples. He tells them straight up, hey, I'm leaving, you get a helper, but your life isn't going to be good, you're going to suffer, and all of you are going to die. Those are like the promises of Christ. It's not authority and power, it's you're all going to die. They're all going to die weird deaths except for John. John lives until old age. You're all going to die, which is also at the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus explains that. Peter, you're going to be hung on a cross. My brother James, he's like the first leader of the church. My brother James is going to be stoned to death, and his head's going to be cut off and carried around all of Israel. Stephen, this dude you guys don't know yet, but he's going to die by stoning. It's not going to be easy. So who do you say that I am? I'm either the Messiah or I'm a king. And if you want a king, you're following the wrong Messiah. Follow Christ, follow the Messiah next week, and then pick up your cross and continue following. Let's pray.